Welcome on in, football fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our DFS and prop preview for tomorrow's two-game slate out there for Christmas. And first off, happy holidays to everyone out there. Hopefully you guys are enjoying some time out there with your family and friends and ready to talk some football out there for tomorrow. So first off, going to break down the DFS side, what I'm doing out there for the two-game slate on Draftkings, and then afterwards I'll look at the prop side in two slips, one over on Prize Picks and one on Underdog, that have already entered for both games tomorrow. So a lot to go through. Let's go ahead and not waste any time at all. Let's start off with first off, a look at the DFS slate. Quarterback is usually a good position to talk about the differences here on this sort of slate, which is vastly different than what we have for main slate. The same kind of lineup construction in terms of two running backs, get the three wide receivers, a flex position defense, kind of like we're used to out there for every single Sunday, but only two games to choose from. So while the lineup construction might be similar to what we had out there for yesterday's main slate, we're going to have to change things up quite a bit when it comes to the correlation. When you have a game go way over its total, maybe a game that's more of a defensive struggle, then you want to make sure you're accounting for that out there in your projections. Luckily for us, this Christmas slate has two absolute bangers and games that should be relatively competitive as well. So I don't think it's as important to maybe get way over the field on one of these games or the other, but if one of them ends up being a shootout, one of them is more just your average kind of game script, you're going to want more exposure to the game that shoots out. So anytime you're playing a quarterback, you want to be thinking about bringing along at least one or two pass catchers along with them, and a lot of times, maybe even a buyback on the other side of that game. And you're still going to want guys from the other game that you're not stacking, but getting well over the field on one versus the other is a good way to correlate out there on this sort of slate. So starting with Lamar Jackson, he is going to be your highest owned quarterback out there for tomorrow, at least as of current ownership projections, but I would argue at just under 30% that he's probably not getting enough attention. On these sort of slates, the salary is usually something that you can throw out of the picture. You're going to have as much salary as you could possibly want out here on this two-game slate. So even though Lamar Jackson is an $8,000, unless you're going with Lamar, Derrick Henry, Joe Mixon, and trying to go out there and play a Nico Collins, you're probably going to be able to fit in whoever the heck you want to. So a Lamar Jackson, I could argue, should probably be closer to 35 to 40%, like we saw the last time that he was on a two-game slate. So it's a solid matchup. The Houston defense, by the way, is really strong, against the run, but against the pass, they've been a lot more susceptible to opposing passing attacks. So at $8,000, you might see a little bit more Lamar because of that defensive matchup, and of course, just the top raw projection on the slate. You got guys like Patrick Mahomes down here going against the Steelers defense. Not the best matchup on paper. They, of course, top 5 against opposing quarterbacks. That would be the one real downside to playing Patrick Mahomes, but they have, of course, favorites out there against the Pittsburgh Steelers on the road, which leads most people to believe that he'd be at least a decent play out there for tomorrow. My favorite two plays, though, especially if you're looking to get a little bit different, would be your lowest two-owned quarterbacks. And out of the two, I'd say my favorite would be CJ Stroud. Even though he is slightly higher owned than what we have there with Russell Wilson, he's got an ideal matchup out there for Christmas. The Ravens defense have been bottom 5 in the league when it comes to defending opposing quarterbacks, and CJ Stroud, though he is without Tank Dell, still going to have Stephon Diggs, who's going to be sidelined. He's got Nico Collins, he's got Dalton Schultz, he's got other guys like Xavier Hutchinson, John Mechie, that have really stepped up in some of the other players' absences that make them viable against this week of a defense. And while the Baltimore Ravens have gotten a little bit better as the year has gone on, when they've played anyone that's had a capable passing offense, it's usually been like 275 plus passing yards, 1 or 2 touchdowns at the very least that they're going out there and throwing, if not nuclear games like we've seen from a few quarterbacks. That, of course, would include Russell Wilson in the first Steelers-Ravens matchup that you had this year, and a few other guys that, make you raise an eyebrow a bit, right? Russell Wilson, we're not used to seeing throwing 4 or 5 touchdowns, throwing for 300, 400 plus passing yards. You've seen a few quarterbacks have those sort of games against the Ravens, which is why I think CJ Stroud would be live. On top of that, he's also got a concentrated offense with Dell and Diggs out of the picture. It's going to be a whole lot of Schultz and Collins out there at wide receiver. Then their last quarterback that I'll mention would be Russell Wilson, who is only about 20% owned out there at quarterback. I think in single entries, he might even be closer to 14, 15% owned. Just like Lamar Jackson out there in single entries is probably going to be closer to like 35 to 40% owned. So these, of course, these projections, I should say, they go out there and reflect the large field GPP ownership, where it tends to get a little bit more spread out. But if you're looking to get different to the field, the one clear option would be a Russell Wilson. And while the matchup isn't ideal, the Kansas City defense has been pretty stout both against the pass and the run this year. He's only $5,500. He is playing as underdogs out there against the Chiefs at home, so he's got the home field advantage going. It is only a 3-point spread between the Chiefs and the Steelers, so if they're going to keep it close, he will have George Pickens back. At least if some of the reports end up coming true, they're all saying that he's going to play out there tomorrow. If that's the case, he's live at $5,500. Without Pickens, without the deep play threat, maybe not my favorite play out there on the slate, but if he has all of those weapons, Jaylen Warren has really started to come on out of the backfield as well. I think he's a lot more live than people would at least think on the surface. Now going over to running back's a position where at least up top, I don't really love these top two plays, and it'd be Henry and Mixon where most people are going at the position. Now these two are playing against each other, so if one's going to go off, that could cannibalize some of the usage and touches out there for the other player. The reason I say that, of course, is a lot of a running back's usage comes down to game script, and when a team's playing from ahead by touchdown, sometimes even a 2-touchdown lead, you're going to see them rely on the run a whole lot more. And if one of these two teams gets into that kind of situation, the usage that one of them is getting is going to directly take away from the usage from the other running back. So I think that both are about 50%. I think a lot of people are choosing one or the other. That's probably the way to go about these top two running backs, but I wouldn't be the biggest fan of using both together. It's not just the fact that they have some anti-correlation going, but it's also the matchups on both sides of the ball. The Ravens have been a top 10 defense against the rush, and the same thing over there from the Houston Texans side. So they've got two tough matchups. They've got two teams that are likely going to try and pass the ball because of that, which means that these two just might get a little bit less touches than what we're used to seeing. So $8,200, $7,700. It's not like I'm fading both players entirely, but I will say that I'm at most probably going to be matching the field on these sort of players, if not going underweight on both the Henry and a Mixon. I slightly prefer guys like Pacheco, who against the Steelers are a bottom 10 rushing defense in the NFL now. They've really fallen off the last few weeks as their tackling has gone worse and worse. Still a top 5 passing unit, so tough matchup out there for Patrick Mahomes, but not so much for guys like Pacheco and a Kareem Hunt. So I think Pacheco would be by far the one that I'd prefer out of those two, but he's only 22% owned. So if I'm not going to love these top two, expensive, very chalky running backs, then maybe I see myself going to some of these slightly lower owned guys like Pacheco. Jaylen Warren, if the Steelers are playing from behind, let's say that you're playing for the Chiefs to be playing from ahead, Jaylen Warren and his receiving upside out of the backfield could be massive out there in that kind of matchup. So a Najee Harris in that same sort of bucket in terms of projection. I would prefer Najee Harris if the Steelers are playing from ahead, as he's more of the traditional running back over there for the Steelers. A lot of these Steelers running backs, heck, even guys like Justice Hill, right, are a little bit script dependent. If the Steelers are playing from behind, I'm playing guys like Jaylen Warren. If the Ravens are playing from behind, and let's say Justice Hill is active, I'm probably playing him over Derrick Henry, as he's the more receiving back out there for Baltimore. This is where you start to see the showdown aspect come into play, because a lot of these conversations that we're having would be galaxy branding, right, out there for a main slate contest. You've got the 10, 11 games to work with. You're not having these sort of conversations, but because there's only 2 games on the docket tomorrow, this kind of correlation matters because you've only got so many players that you can fit into a lineup. So I think you need to be thinking about game script when you're especially picking your quarterback, but that is going to translate to some of the other positions as well, including running back like we just hit on. Kareem Hunt here at $5,200. If you think the Chiefs are going to be playing from way ahead, he could see closer to like 15 to 20 touches. That would be his way to the optimal lineup. Justice Hill is questionable, so guys like Mitchell and Ali were priced up just a little bit in anticipation of that. Not my favorite plays, though. Just like Derrick Henry up top, I don't think it's the best game situation for those kind of guys to go off. If I was going to look for a pure punt at the running back position, it might be a Cordero Patterson, gadget player over there for the Steelers, a Samaje Perine, third down back over there for Kansas City. It would be the kind of players that I'd be looking to. Maybe a Patrick Ricard if I really wanted to get outside the box with it, but a Daria Bungawale, he's only going to play if the Texans are playing from way, way behind. So this would be more of a game script play if you're going really heavy on the Ravens, for example. Outside of him, though, these guys like Mitchell, Ali, Pierce, Ricard, even like an Andrew Beck and Steele for sure, aren't even making my large field GPP exposure. So running back, not really the best position to go out there and punt on this 2-game slate, as they're not going to see as many snaps as, let's say, like the second, third, and fourth string wide receivers will on teams. Which, speaking of, wide receiver is where it's going to open up a lot more. We're still going to have some guys towards the top, some studs that we're mixing in, but towards the bottom is where these wide receivers are a lot more viable as pure punts. So let's start towards the top. Let's start with some of our premier options, where Nico Collins is going to be one of my core plays for tomorrow. Of course, guys, over here on the right, I do have my player pool blacked out. For all of that, make sure to check out the version on the Patreon page, which not only will have my entire player pool posted, and includes core plays, every player I'm using out there in my GPP player pool, but also the completely up-to-date projections. So this, of course, is coming out a day before the slate goes live. So we're going to have some changes to these projections by the time we get to lock tomorrow. For all of that up-to-date information, right, as soon as everything changes, maybe there's some injury news that shakes some things up as well. Make sure to check out the Patreon page for all of that. There's a link in the description of the video to go out there and join over there. But what's worth noting about this wide receiver position is that Nico Collins, I'm going to have in nearly every single lineup. I just think that it's a massive game out there for him. It's a perfect matchup against this Ravens defense. They're bottom 5 in the league in almost every single wide receiver metric when it comes to defending them. And also, they're without Tank Dell now, right? They were already without Diggs. Now they're without Dell. Nico Collins is essentially going to be the entire wide receiver offense over there for the Houston Texans. So I love him at $8,300. Definitely a little bit expensive, but you can see the points per dollar value is actually tied for the highest on the entire slate. George Pickens here, 2.55x. We'll talk about him here in a second too. I think he's an excellent play, but Nico Collins is an absolute jam spot for me. And if he's going to be a jam spot at $8,300, I'm going to have a harder time fitting in some of these more expensive running backs. So that's part of the reason that I'm not as high on those sort of players, and why I'm playing so much Nico Collins. George Pickens, he is expected to play out there tomorrow, but he is somebody that we're going to have to monitor status-wise out there before lock. But at $6,600, I would argue that he's one of the best plays on the slate. And in fact, if you look at points per dollar value, he's right up there with a Nico Collins, and he's in the kind of game script as underdogs against the Chiefs, which could be really beneficial for his kind of skill set. Not only is he a wide receiver that would see more snaps, perhaps more targets when playing from behind, but he's a downfield threat. He's the kind of guy who'll get you this 30, 40-yard catches, and if they're playing from behind, the Steelers are going to have to force their hand just a little bit more. So I think if you're going to play some of the running backs from the Chiefs, maybe a Pacheco, a Hunt, as we mentioned before, that Pickens would be a really good buyback spot. And it doesn't necessarily have to be on like a Patrick Mahomes lineup. This could be like a one-off set of correlation where maybe you are going with a Lamar stack, you're running it back with Nico Collins up top, right? That's the game that you're getting quote-unquote over the field on. The other part of your correlation could be using a Chiefs running back, maybe one Chiefs wide receiver, and buying it back with somebody like George Pickens and hoping that he's the concentrated usage over there on the Steelers. So I love Collins. I really like a George Pickens as well, which, as you could guess, is going to take me away from some of these mid to lower tier wide receivers. I do like some Hollywood Brown, though. So it was his first week back last week, and he had one of his better performances for quite some time. I think that having Patrick Mahomes as your quarterback is going to do wonders out there for his stats, but he was already a big play wide receiver on the teams that he played for previously, whether that was Baltimore, over there with the Cardinals. You know, he's the kind of guy who'd get you those 50, 60-yard touchdowns. So out there in the large field GPP, though it's a tough matchup against the Steelers secondary with their tackling issues lately, that could translate to a lot of yards after catch. So Hollywood Brown definitely going to be in some lineups as well. With all the injuries on the Steelers, you still can look at somebody like Calvin Austin, but with George Pickens coming back, it definitely takes away from his usage a little bit. John Mechie, on the other hand, with Tank Dell rolled out, is going to be a key fixture over there for the Texans. Robert Woods as well, he's a very good blocker for the Texans, so maybe not going to get the most targets, at least compared to like a Mechie or even like an Xavier Hutchinson, but Woods is going to be out there for a ton of snaps because of his blocking ability. You could look for Hutchinson as well. He's also going to see more snaps out there for the Texans. And for the Steelers, you do have a few wide receivers that you could keep an eye on. Ben Skoranek is questionable, so you might not end up playing. And before he went out last week, he was the number one player on the Steelers when it came to snaps at wide receiver. Now, partially could be because he's a good blocking wide receiver. George Pickens, by the way, I know he's got all the big, flashy catches, all of that. Everyone knows about that with Pickens. He's a damn good blocker, too. So when he was out, they had to figure out another really physical wide receiver to go out there and make up for that kind of blocking. And that ended up being Skoranek, which really surprised me, even as a Steeler fan, that would have ended up happening. If he ends up missing more time, that is going to give a lot more usage to guys like a Van Jefferson and Williams. They're bigger bodied wide receivers, guys that are capable of being physical on the block. If you have Skoranek out, I know we have Pickens back. I think you're going to see a lot more of those sort of players playing. So a lot of those injuries, they don't seem like big pieces of news, but somebody like Skoranek not playing is going to put me on those sort of third, fourth string wide receivers out there for Pittsburgh. It's worth noting that Nelson Aguilar is also questionable. Also, Zay Flowers out there for Baltimore, but I'm not expecting any of those players to be missing time. Lastly, we'll go through our tight end position here, where Travis Kelce has a really good matchup against the Steelers. The Steelers, if you don't know, are bottom 10 in the league when it comes to defending opposing tight ends, which is really the only position that they struggle at defending. So $5,300, I think it is a more than fair enough price tag. In fact, he could probably be like $6,500, and I think it would make sense with how soft the pricing is here. Mark Andrews at $4,300, also a pretty solid play when it comes to his PPD, right? Points per dollar efficiency. He's 2.4x about out there at that spot. Dalton Schultz, Pat Freiermuth, all solid options as well. And you can see here that they're all getting ownership. So I'll include Isaiah Likely into that conversation as well. Mark Andrews getting significantly more steam than we have there with Likely, but all of these starting tight ends are all in that like 25 to 40% range. So there's not a ton of leverage to be had out there at tight end. More so you're correlating it out there with your quarterback, maybe a buyback to your main stack out there for tomorrow, as you're trying to get some of that touchdown equity out there with these tight ends. If you're looking for a pure punt play, just like wide receiver, there are a few guys down low that we talked about using. Over here at tight end, you've got guys like Darnell Washington that are live, and Noah Gray. I'm not sure I'd call him a punt at $3,300, but at sub 10% owned, he could be a spot to get really different to the field. You can even throw Pruitt in there. He's been playing quite a few snaps for the Steelers, or even a Connor Hayward. They have 4 tight ends on the Steelers that are playing at least 15% of snaps. So if you're looking to really get different to the rest of the field, tight end might not be a terrible spot to do so. And then for defense, I don't like to spend a whole lot of time here, as defense is a complete crapshoot, in my opinion, especially large field GPPs. I kind of just play all 4 defenses and then move on. So that is going to be my strategy out there for tomorrow. I'm going to have all 4 in my player pool, but just make sure that you're correlating it properly, right? Like you shouldn't be playing a 5-6 leg stack out there against your defense, right? Like maybe 1 or 2 players slip into a lineup that you're playing against your defense/special teams, but that's the main thing that you want to focus on. The other thing I'll point out would be the ownership aspect, where of course the Ravens defense would be your most popular for tomorrow. So if you need to get a little bit different, maybe offset some ownership that you took in another position, your quote unquote low owned defenses would be the Steelers at about 22.5%, and then the Texans are there at just 13.4%. And now for the prop side of things, where I've got a prop slip on each prop site that you might want to consider entering yourself. So we're going to start over here in Prize Picks, where we're going to got a slip out here for the first game. So it's going to be an over on Travis Kelce receiving yards paired up with an over on Pickens receiving yards. So a little bit of correlation in a closer, higher scoring game script. I guess that's the idea out there with these two correlating, but it's more so just line value on these two spots. Travis Kelce is at 45.5 yards to 47.5 yards on most of those major books. And as I mentioned during the fantasy section, the Steelers are a bottom 10 defense at defending opposing tight ends. They've been really good against quarterbacks, solid against opposing running backs, but the one position that they truly struggle at defending would be that tight end position. So at 44.5 yards, he is juiced way over his 4.5 reception line out there on sportsbooks. If as long as he can get us about 10 yards per reception, he's going to be at a really good spot to cover this kind of line. So 44.5, a little bit of correlation at the second spot is why I mixed that in. And then with Pickens, a lot of this is his health. We've gotten good news about his health all week. So as he starts to get closer to lock, I think you're going to see people hammering his overs. He's juiced towards the over at 4.5 receptions at books like a Draftkings and a Pinnacle. So I think as you start to see people adjusting to that news, you're going to see people taking this over on receiving yards. And even if he only got us to 4 receptions, let's say he didn't cover that kind of 4.5 receiving yard line, reception line, I should say, he's more than capable of going over 62.5 receiving yards. He's the sort of wide receiver that has deep play threat written all over him. He's got those 15 to 20 yard downfield receptions all the time. And against a defense like this that runs a bunch of man coverage, he has big play potential, especially even yards after catch ability against this sort of team in the Chiefs. So 61.5 yards, a lot of this is going to come down to the health. But if we continue to get that positive outlook on George Pickens, I think that this could be at 64, 65.5 by the time we get to lock, along with Kelsey, which I think could be even up close to 47.5 yards by the time that we get to lock. So a little bit of correlation between these two. And the best part is over here on Prize Picks, it still pays a full 3x payout. And then the other prop slip I took was over here on the underdog side, and it is going to be for the second game between the Ravens and the Texans. So the first prop I took was this over on Lamar Jackson passing yards, which I got 1 yard lower, but not the biggest problem in the world, taking it 1 yard higher, and a really solid matchup against this Texans defense. They rank bottom 10 in the league when it comes to passing yards allowed per game, but they are a really good rushing defense, ranking top 10 in most metrics against running backs. So while they like to run the ball over there in Baltimore, it's the kind of game script, the kind of matchup that is going to lead to more passing than usual. And with how efficient, how amazing Lamar has looked this year, I mean, through the air, he's been one of the best passing quarterbacks that we have in the NFL. Yet on top of that, his ability to be electric on the ground, and you can see why he's in the MVP conversation. Matchup-wise, though, I think you're going to see the passing attack carry it here of just a little bit more than usual. So that's why I'm taking that over out there in passing yards. And just like the first slip, if this is a closely competitive game, goes a little bit higher scoring than what we're expecting out there, there could be some correlation between these two as well. And the Nico Collins prop I actually took 1 yard higher. So while the Lamar ended up bumping up a yard, this prop ended up bumping down a yard by the time that I took it. So even better value now compared to where I took it before. But Nico Collins with Tank Dell out, Diggs, he's not expected to play. He is going to be that number 1 wide receiver. And with the solid matchup against the Ravens defense, which ranked bottom 5 in pretty much every single category that you can think of at defending opposing wide receivers, you'd see why I want to take this over. It's a spot where he's going to see a ton of concentrated usage. It's a solid matchup. They're playing from behind, right? They are underdogs against this Ravens team. All of that is why I'd want to take that over. So I don't think there's a ton of correlation between these two slips, right? A lot of times I'm looking for a ton of correlation when there's like a 7 to a 14 point spread, but it's a 3-point spread in the first game, only a 5.5 point spread out there in the second. So I'm going with this sort of approach instead. So of course, guys, for all the different prop slips that I'm entering, make sure to check out the Patreon page for all of that. Link in the description of the video to go out there and join the Patreon page. Not only am I going to be posting all the slips that I take before lock tomorrow, but all the reasoning behind it as well. So if you want to catch all of that as soon as I'm entering it, make sure to join the Patreon page. That's all for the Christmas preview, guys. Before you hopping out of here, go ahead and smash that like button. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the content to come, which will include a Thursday night football preview for this week, the main slate out there this weekend, and all the content throughout the NFL playoffs. It's been a pleasure bringing you guys this preview. Best of luck out there with all of your exposure tomorrow, whether it's over there in GPPs, hopefully you guys can take something down, or over there on the prop side, hopefully you guys can cash out and make it a profitable one as well. Also, go ahead and comment down below who you guys have got as your top scorer out there for tomorrow's slate. If you guys can give me the top scorer and their raw fantasy score within 2 points, you will win a free month access to my Patreon page. That will be their Draftkings score, so give me that top score and your projection for them for a free chance to earn that Patreon membership. On there, of course, is where I'm posting all my projections for DFS, my entire player pool, everything up to date as it changes before lock, and all the prop slips that I'm entering for Prize Picks and Underdog. So, of course, you guys can join there in the link in the description of the video, but if you want a chance to check it out, see what it's all about beforehand before you end up joining, make sure to check it out and enter the giveaway as well. That's all I've got, guys. Appreciate your support here on the channel. Best of luck and Merry Christmas to everyone out there.